Welcome back. Today, I'm going to do a live reaction to a video that I came across in my feed when I was at work. Tucker Carlson is interviewing Mike Huckabee, who is apparently the ambassador to Israel. And the few minutes that I watched, I heard some striking comments about his perspective of Israel and his perspective of Christians. It was interesting, he excluded Catholics. Most people do. But you must understand Catholics and Christians are about the same. I don't care what you think, I don't care how you feel, but if you actually been in the Catholic Church and you've been in the Christian church, which I've been in both, you'll notice the similarities. In fact, I'll give you some history. The Apostle Paul started the church out of prison, which we now call Christianity. A couple of years after that, the Romans wanted a variant of the same movement that was growing because they tried to persecute them. They didn't succeed. So they started their own variant, which was called Catholicism, which eventually split into several different churches, just like the Christian formation of the church Paul started, split up into 7, and then split up again and again, which now we have so many Christian churches, you don't know which way they're going. But one thing I had decided was to denounce my Christianity for personal reasons back in 2023 to 2024. If you want to take a wild guess, besides get a little frustrated with, oh no, you're atheist, why don't you look up what happened between 2023 and 2024? You might find out why. And if you still want to talk shit, maybe you need to read the Bible. I'll give you a hint. Something in the Old Testament. Anyway, this interview was quite interesting. The few minutes I watched, and I want to do a reaction to it because I'm going to point out some things that I found very striking. And then I'm going to read and compare some things that's going to be even more striking. Now, I'm going to have to edit the first half because I forgot to turn my mic on. So like I said, this is a live stream, so I'm going to edit the first half out so it can process and upload. But you'll be seeing me actually maneuvering through tabs live. So let's get started with this video and let's brace yourself.
Who are the people? Who are the modern, yes, who are the descendants? So we know, and I believe, and I agree with you as a Christian, that God promised this land from modern day Iraq to modern day Egypt to this people, the Jews, to Abram's, actually not to Abram's descendants, as it says in Genesis 15. Who are his descendants now, and how do we know who they are?
I think they're the Jews, and we know who they are because they've always been a Jewish people. There has been an unbroken line of Jewish people, and they've lived in this land for 3,800 years. Sometimes not very many of them, because they were chased out all over the world. They were hunted down. They were almost annihilated during the Holocaust. They came back.
Well, I want you to understand something. Number one, let's go all the way back, and you can read this in the Bible, because I want you guys to read this, especially Christians, because I found that most Christians don't even read the Bible. Y'all just go along with your minister says. Number one, the Jews weren't chased all over the place. The Jews spread, multiplied. They were persecuted along with the Israelites. And then under Roman rule, it was mostly Jews left. Most of the Israelites got wiped out by the Greeks. You're not going to find that because the Romans took a segment out of the collection of books, collection of scrolls that explained what happened during the persecution of the Jews and the Israelites after the last 3 books of the Old Testament. I found this out by listening to one of the books. The thing is, the Jews stayed in the area for the most part, even under Roman rule. Now, after Jesus died, I'm not going to say how because everyone, oh, anti-Semitic. I don't give a shit. In fact, I'm just going to say it. After the Jews proclaimed that Jesus should die under the Roman rule, the Romans started persecuting him after Paul started the beginning of the Christian faith, because the catch to this was the remaining Jews and the 11 apostles started losing their faith. Who picked up the mantle? Roman guards who witnessed Jesus at the time, and other people who was told about it. The Romans, they picked up the mantle. The rest of the Jews stopped believing, obviously. Number two, I've always believed that Abraham too had two sons, and out of the two sons, his blessings of his sons being blessed as the chosen children were going to continue. The thing is, I always wondered if the Jews are the Jews today, and who are the other groups that was from his firstborn son, which was Ishmael. I thought about it. I said, there's one other culture besides the Jews in that region that believes in God, kind of follow the ways of Jesus. And one day I went to a Muslim church. I didn't really care for it. I'm not going to explain why. But going there, I noticed they actually preach very similarly like Christians, except they read out of two books. So over time, I was just noticing things. Every time I read the Bible, I noticed some things. Then I started seeing the wars in the Middle East. And I started to see the ramping up of Israel, ramping up on the Muslims, the hate towards the Muslims. But one thing I noticed, most Muslim countries are peaceful until you piss them off, like America. So I said, there's a battle, there's a war down there. There's constant war. It's Israel against these Muslims. I remember the Jews was warring with the Gentiles, Pharisees, and Sadducees during Jesus' time, but he called them all hypocrites. Every single one of them, including his 12 apostles, he called them, or disciples, he called them hypocrites. Every time. Turn around, call them hypocrites. Most Christian churches don't tell you that much. They don't even really tell you that often. Jesus would call them, everybody a hypocrite. One day I was like, wait a minute. I've been to a Muslim church. I also been to a Jewish church. They talk the same way. I've been to a Christian churches, and I've been to a Catholic church, or maybe two. After thinking about it, I said, Isaac is the descendant of Abraham, which down the road begat David, which down the road guided the Israelites. So who was Ishmael's generation? I said, it's got to be the Muslims. It's got to be. The problem is, both Abraham's sons were promised land and blessed. The catch is, the Jews can't just claim everything. But that's what they're doing. I want you to look at something. Ishmael in Islam. This is a Wikipedia. I found other sources. And the funny thing, other sources that were linked was throwing some controversial bullshit. And that's why I'm very careful with links. And if I see a link from a search, keyword search that I'm looking up, and I see the links are having different contradictory wording, I gotta go straight to Wikipedia. Sadly, Wikipedia is straightforward. Very straightforward. Check this out. I'm going to zoom in so you can see what this says. Ishmael, which is the firstborn son of Abraham from the Egyptian so-called slavery time, gave birth to Ishmael. She was Egyptian. Saudi Arabia is very close to Egypt. And anything around that region, south and west, unfortunately, is Muslim, regardless of what you call them. They're Muslim and Islamic. Most of Africa is Muslim and Islamic, whether you know that or not. Some will say, oh, they got Christian. No, they're only Christian because of Europe colonizing the region. Ishmael, Arabic, is regarded by Muslims as an Islamic prophet born to Abraham and Hagar. He is the namesake of the Ishmaelites who were descended from him. In Islam, he is associated with Mecca and the construction of the Kaaba within today's Majd al-Haram, which is the holiest Islamic site. Muslims also consider him to be a direct ancestor to Muhammad. His paternal half-brother was Isaac, the forefather of the Israelites. It's amazing what they don't tell you in America. Now, the Israelites, people to this very day think are Jewish. They were not. I'm going to tell you a story, and you guys are going to have to read this. It's in the Bible. King Saul was instructed to take over the land of Judah. And at that time, God instructed the kings of Israel to wipe out everybody. Saul decided not to. He saved the women and children and the livestock. So they mixed. And guess what happened? They didn't get along. So Israel split into two. Israel stayed in the south. Judahites mixed with Israelites went to the north. And so there was two houses. Now, earlier, I was mentioning that if I did, it was probably my prior recording before I realized I didn't record. There's some missing books that's tied to the Bible. And it explained what happened to the Judahites and the Israelites. Because in the book of the Old Testament, the last three, they were in persecution and in slavery for the last time. The unfortunate scenario was the Greeks were persecuting both. And then later the Romans. The only catch to that was the Israelites were trying to ask for help and try to follow God's ways. And the Greeks pretty much slaughtered them all, leaving the Jews. And then when the Romans came in, the Jews existed under Rome. We all know what happened with Jesus. It was basically spared the Jews. And then when the Romans, which Apostle Paul was the one who created the Christian church, started following the ways of Jesus, along with several other soldiers and guards, they were persecuted. So Paul created Christianity. He created the first church, which split into 7. And then later on, the Romans decided, since they couldn't stop the movement, to create their own variant, which if you understand history, the Catholic Church took over Rome eventually as a superpower, and they had to put a stop to that. So Mr. Huckabee wants to claim that the land only belongs to Jews. That's kind of funny. The problem is they only own a small sliver. But you heard what Tucker Carlson said, the entire region between Egypt to Iran. So fast forward today, you can kind of get some context why Israel is slowly trying to expand out. In fact, since the 1940s, they've been slowly expanding out, pushing out the Palestinians that allowed them to come back. They've been fighting with the Lebanese and the Jordanians. They've been pushing out. But you want to understand where terrorist groups come from. Well, you start picking on a country and you start having rebels and extremists to push back. Well, there you go. Of course, Americans call them terrorists. And they would understand why. We have the same problem pushing people's buttons overseas. So now we are hearing from Mr. Huckabee, the only people that should stake claim to that region is Jews, not the Saudis, not any Muslim, just Jews. So that's a little conflict of interest there, because if y'all understand the story of Abraham, his sons, both of them were blessed to have promised land. Whether you want to believe it or not, they were blessed. We're going to get into something interesting about Ishmael and his blessing too. Let's continue on with the interview.
To this day, Tucker, they represent, you know how many Jews there are in the whole world?
Please,
No,
I understand. Look, first of all, the greatest genocide of Jews no one ever mentions was by the Romans, where they were literally banned from Jerusalem for 500 years.
Yeah.
Keyword. They were persecuted and destroyed and wiped out almost entirely, okay? They were banned from Jerusalem after Jesus died. Now, I want you to understand something. If anybody ever wondered how they ended up on the northern side of the Mediterranean, the answer was just spoken. Mr. Tucker Carlson just said it. If you ever wonder how they got involved with Hitler, you may want to look up the Holocaust Museum in Europe, not in America. Because I looked up the documentaries from the Holocaust Museum in Europe, and I found something very interesting. Very interesting. But if you want to understand how they got into Europe, there you go. Because you got to remember, the Roman Empire encompassed the whole southern region of Europe, wrapping around what they call West Asia, and most of the entire northern regions of Africa. That's how much Rome encompassed. Even sections of the eastern northern regions of what we call parts of Russia. That's how Putin had paintings of Jesus, because most of what you would say would be Russian was under the Roman Empire. So was Germany. In fact, Germany had a hand in the fall of the Roman Empire, if you guys didn't know that. I found that out from my stepmom, because she's German.
Of course.
And it's all awful. And I'm opposed to all of that. I'm opposed to mass killing of anybody, period. I'm opposed to
hear
killing.
you say that.
I mean it.
Yeah.
And I hope we
believe
can agree
that.
on that.
I believe that.
My question is, and it's not a bumper sticker answer, it's a sincere answer, how do we know? Because what you're saying is that certain people have a title to a highly contested region. They own it in some deep sense. So I think it's fair to ask, who are they and how do we know? So the current prime minister's ancestors weren't from here within recorded history. He has no deed. Bibi Netanyahu, on one side, his family's from Poland. They're from Eastern Europe. So how do we know that he has a connection to the people who God promised the land to, Abram's descendants? How do we know that?
Well, if you take the genealogies that come not only from the Old but the New Testament, you see that there is a historical connection through the entirety of the Old and the New Testament that details the Jewish connection to this land.
Does that include Bibi's family? How do we know that if his family
they were
comes here,
scattered?
But how do we know it's the same people? No, why is that crazy? If you say to me,
He's asked a very viable question, but the unfortunate scenario is this. Okay, so Mr. Huckabee is saying the genealogies of Jews from the Old Testament to the New. He's kind of correct, but the problem is the Jews were mixed with the Israelites, and then they split. So once the house is split, the mixed breed Jews became purebred in the form of what were consolidated in their camp. Okay, the Israelites who didn't mix with the Jewish women stayed pure. Okay, fast forward to Greek and Roman time. Well, I'm pretty sure they started mixing with some of the Romans. And then when they started migrating into Europe, they started mixing with them. Now, keep in mind, Mr. Huckabee is right about one thing. During the Roman times, up to the modern times of Germany, they did migrate all over the place. They did mix in. In fact, you will find out Hitler gave an ultimatum of a few months. If you're a Jew, an immigrant from Africa or anywhere else, if you're not German, 100% German, you must get out of my country before I start a war with Russia. He actually put that out there. The Jews that were in Germany, some went south, some went east, and some went west. He also told them, do not go to Poland, because he was going to attack Poland too. Poland anyway. So, unfortunately, if Netanyahu's family migrated to Poland during the war and survived, and then later migrated with the rest of them after World War II back to the Gaza Strip, which the Palestinians allowed them to come back, technically, he is by blood Jewish descent, but most likely heavily mixed, unfortunately. And you can look at it, to be honest, most Jews are not pure anymore anyway. Look how bright and light they are. They almost look European. An actual, most of that region looks more or less mixed with European or Roman. Because if you look at the Egyptian wall paint mostly the people brown to dark brown. There's very few light-skinned people or white people. Now, granted, there are white people in the Bible. I'm not going to touch on that today. That's a whole nother subject for another day. But that region was intercontinentally mixed, and it's evident on the wall, but there was more brown to dark than white. So, unfortunately, not telling you could come back, but what he's doing is wrong. They're all doing it wrong. So let's continue on.
If they speak the same language, if they worship the same God, if they follow the same Bible,
hold on, let's run
the
this
Jewish connection to this land.
Does that include, on one side, his family's from Poland? They're from Eastern Europe. So how do we know that he has a connection to the people who God promised the land to, Abram's descendants? How do we know that?
Well, if you take the genealogies that come not only from the Old but the New Testament, you see that there is a historical connection through the entirety of the Old and the New Testament that details the Jewish connection to this land.
Does that include Bibi's family? How do we know that if his family
they were
comes here?
Scattered,
but how do we know it's the same people? If you say to me,
if they speak the same language,
and there's something interesting. The Persians are mentioned in the Bible who actually had to persecute the Israelites per God, and unfortunately, Persians today are Iranians. Isn't that ironic? But God allowed the Persians to capture them and persecute them, I think twice, maybe more than that. Now, that doesn't constitute the reason behind this back and forth war, but it could be a reason. because nobody got along back then. And God used certain large families in the empire to punish the house of Israel and the house of Judah. But yeah, the Persians were what you call now Iranians, probably Pakistanians, Afghanistan. That whole region were Persian at the time.
They worship the same God, if they follow the same Bible, if they follow the same cultures and traditions, and they always pray next year in Jerusalem, and they pray.
Let's just run this back. This is where it got creepy for me.
Why is that crazy? If you say to me,
if they speak the same language, if they worship the same God, if they
wait a minute, let's go back for a minute.
Know that he has a connection to the people who God promised the land to, Abram's descendants. How do we know that?
Well, if you take the genealogies that come not only from the Old but the New Testament, you see that there is a historical connection through the entirety of the Old and the New Testament that details the Jewish connection to this land.
Does that include Bibi's family? How do we know that if his family
if they
comes
were scattered,
here, but how do we know it's the same people? Why is that crazy? If you say to me,
if they speak the same language, if they worship the same God, if they follow the same Bible, if they follow the same cultures and traditions, and they always pray next year in Jerusalem, and they pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and they pray facing toward Jerusalem, does that not give you a little bit of a clue as to who they are?
Let's go through those things.
That's a lot of bullshit. That's a lot of shit, bro. Like this man, first of all, last I looked, I think he's Baptist. Number one. He's not even Israeli. I guarantee you that. And he's got a whole laundry list of a scroll of what you are classified to do to be Jewish. Are you kidding me? And then he said you speak the same language. Last I checked, they speak English. Now, I'm not sure what the Israeli language really is, but every time we see them, they speak in English, so they speak in two languages. That's a contradictory right there. Number two, Muslims in that region, if Israel allows, pray in Jerusalem. Now, since the war, we haven't heard much about Mecca or even Muslims going to Jerusalem anymore. So, yeah. Now, this coming out of Mr. Huckabee's mouth cuts out most Christians. Isn't that interesting?
Because I would like to have a rational, this is a conversation I've wanted. Bless you. Thank you for doing this. Let's just go through those things.
Okay.
So one of the things I admire most about Israel is they resurrected a dead language in 1948. Good for them.
Well, they really didn't.
1948 is also when they moved back to Palestine, pretty much, at least around that time. And resurrecting dead language. Here's the catch. Most of the northeastern African regions were still speaking Hebrew. In fact, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they had to find somebody to translate the scrolls because no one spoke Hebrew. They had to go throughout parts of the western parts of Africa along the Dead Sea to find out who can translate the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why some of the books were also located in Ethiopia. You see how people like to speak up for Israel and give them credit where credit is not due? This is why I always tell people, you better know your history. A lot happened in the 1940s. And it's funny because 10 years after that, guess who started getting picked on? Iran.
Resurrected. It was existent.
Okay, I'm not. That's not. That's a compliment. I'm not slighting.
No. But it is the first time in all of human history that a language has survived through this length of time. It's. I would call it. You might not, but I would call it a miracle. One of many.
Honestly, let me clear the air up on that. Let me clear it because first of all, if anybody understands the story of Nimrod and Tower of Babel, God changed the actual original language to many languages. So what Mr. Huckabee is saying is bullshit because let's just take the Asian culture, for instance. Let's look at Chinese, Mandarin. I guarantee you, Mandarin is probably one of the oldest languages on this earth. One of the oldest. Let's look at the that were genocidally wiped the fuck out. I guarantee you, their language is by far one of the oldest on this planet. Let's get even more interestingly accurate. Greek and Roman. They spoke Greek. If you look up Greek language, it is now English. The English language is a subsidiary derivative of Greek. So I don't know what Mr. Huckabee is talking about. There is a great many languages just as old as Hebrew since the dawn of the fall of Babylon, thanks to Nimrod. You cannot say Hebrew is the oldest language because, to be honest, even before that, archaeologists even admit they still don't even know what language Adam and Eve spoke. Because of what Nimrod did, one language turned into many. So no one knows for sure what language was spoken anymore. Because there's a chance whatever language Noah spoke ended up being something else. Because Nimrod was a descendant of Noah. And you saw what happened to him. He went left. So most people don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And most people just say shit just to sound credible. But again, we don't know what was the original language. But yes, Hebrew is old, but it's not as old as every other language on this planet. Now, there is a case that languages mixed with other languages because once that happened at the Tower of Babel, they had to refigure out how to communicate with each other. And then families mixed again and mixed again. Trust me, we're still mixing. I guarantee you that mixture of families with two different languages created new languages. And then another, it's like, make it make sense. So, he don't even know his history, obviously. And he's supposed to be like a former minister or something. Like, bro, I think he's Baptist. It's fucking wild.
Okay, that you can attribute to this
I
language.
think it's wonderful as someone who loves language.
Netanyahu.
Netanyahu's parents did not speak Hebrew. Okay, they didn't live in this region. Netanyahu, the founders of this country, were mostly secular. Some of them were avowed atheists. They were not praying for the peace of Jerusalem. They weren't praying at all because they didn't believe in God.
Look, see, and that's the one thing you got to pay attention to. In fact, number one, in the book of the Old Testament or in the other missing books that was taken out, you find out, just in fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, it is stated half, at least the first half was Hebrew, the second was Greek. You will find out the Greeks forced the Israelites and the Jews to stop speaking Hebrew and wanted the Israelites and Jews to stop speaking Hebrew. In fact, the Greeks and Romans wanted them to stop worshiping God. That's what made them get slaughtered and tortured and persecuted. No one wanted to follow God's way. Nobody. It was just a small sect, and even they was dropping the ball. Now, the atheists and not believing in God part, well, that's obvious because when Jesus was born, they still didn't believe. Most, if not all, but except the 12, let's just say 11 because one betrayed Jesus. Only 11 plus Mary believed. That's it. That's it. The rest of the population did not believe and they had him killed. So that makes you wonder. In fact, that should make you ask, where did Judaism come from then? Why did it all of a sudden adopt? Well, we won't get to that figuratively. And the rest you can figure out on your own.
God. Theology linking their families to the people of this land 3,000 years ago. They're not. So how do we know, since they didn't share a language, they didn't share a religion, they had no religion whatsoever, how do we know that they had a right to come here from Eastern Europe and
but they were scattered.
Take the land?
They were scattered to East. They were scattered all over the world. There were many in Ethiopia. They were in Russia. They were in Poland. They were throughout Asia.
Romans
Jews were
that.
all over the place, but they were still Jews. But they were still Jews.
Okay, so then let me get to the nub of the question, since again, a lot is at stake, a lot of money is at stake. Land is very valuable. Israel has a lot of resources. By the way, if you're accused of a crime, you can hide here. That's a pretty good passport to have. It's a good thing, right? So who's entitled to it? I don't understand. Very discouraged in the United States from asking this question for some reason. It's a totally rational
I'm
question.
not discouraged.
No, you're not discouraging.
Yeah.
Others will be like, shut up, Nazi. It's a foundational question. Are you speaking of an ethnic group?
Well, I think you're looking at, for many people, it is religious. There are people who may not have a deep religious connection to Judaism, but they're still Jews.
Okay, so it's an ethnic category.
It is ethnic, but it is also religious. It is rooted in religion. You can't take it out of it. Now, that means
then how can an atheist...
Well, I will tell you this. There are some people who say, I'm Christian. They never go to church. They never pray. They never...
I'm going to just put my 2 cents on this. Let's look at something, and this is critical. Before churches was formed by Paul, people were gathering to listen. Before that, most cultures, and it still exists today with most cultures, didn't have anything that would be called or constitute as a church. Most cultures had more like a witch doctor or a priest. That was it. Israel, before they met Judah, they had priests appointed by God, and God instructed them to build a temple called Temple of Tabernacles, which the Ark of the Covenant was sitting inside, which was God's throne. It was a smaller variant of God's throne. That's where he existed. Only the priests were allowed in. The rest of the Israelites weren't allowed out. When God spoke, he either spoke outside the temple or through the priest. There was no such thing as gathering and a minister running their mouth. And I'm sorry I sound offensive, but I'll be honest, half the time if I go to church with friends, relative or can help me because I already know about it. I already know it. I've been practicing it. It's like you're telling me something I don't know. Like just tell me something that I don't know, or you're telling me something I already know. Like you're wasting my time. So, the problem is there was no such thing as religion in the beginning. I have a theory formulated between the Greek and Roman Empire, ergo Paul. Paul wanted a gathering. The misconception behind that is Romans and Greeks gathered in places called synagogues. The other misconception is, and is still presumed today, is the people that gather around Jesus is kind of a symbolic level of a church. Wrong. It wasn't. When Jesus traveled, people gathered and they asked him questions, and then he spoke, and when he was done, he left. He hauled ass. In fact, you'll find out between the accounts of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, half the time he won't be bothered because, one, if he did speak, most of the people, in fact, every time he spoke, they got even more furious because they didn't like the answers. Number two, most of them didn't want to listen to him anyway. He got tired of people following him and gathering around him and bugging him, especially if you don't want to listen. Just no religion until Apostle Paul started the church and really came about. And to be honest, Jesus said, I am the church. Church is where it's supposed to exist. That's why it's so corrupt and divided now. That's why it's so corrupt and divided now. In other words, we're supposed to follow God's principle, which no one really does. In other words, we're supposed to follow God's principle, which no one really does, right? We're supposed to follow what Jesus said. In Matthew, it literally says that. If you mark, you can get a different account. I just found that out. In fact, I found out the account. I just found that out. In fact, I found out the book of Mark is manipulated. You're not gonna know manipulated. You're not gonna know until you find specific Bibles that actually footnoted. But Matthew has a whole different account of what Jesus actually did and said. There's a whole different account of what Jesus actually did and said. And basically Jesus said, I want you to go tell everybody commandments. Jesus said, I want you to go tell everybody commandments that I told you to follow God on the seventh day. That's it. Simple. All this extra stuff you got here in church, you should know already. You should. I mean, the Bible's right there too. If you don't know, it's not that hard. But for those who don't know, you may have to go to church so somebody can read it for you. It is what it is. To each his own. But Mr. Huckabee is saying it is a religious thing, again, that singles out everybody else who is not Jewish. Present offerings and worship him. Now, here is where things get very interesting, and this is going to explain and describe why the Jews are we not all one Father. Okay,